The voice cut across the ceremony grounds like a blade through silk. "You there? What exactly do you think you're doing here?" Brigadier General Marcus Holt strode toward the back of the VIP section, his polished shoes clicking against the stone pathway, every eye in the crowd turning to follow him. The object of his attention stood near the velvet rope barrier, a man who looked like he had wandered in from another world entirely. His field jacket was at least 30 years old, the olive drab fabric worn thin at the elbows and patched in places with mismatched thread. His boots were held together with determination and not much else. His face bore the deep creases of a life lived mostly outdoors, and a thin scar traced a path from his left temple down to his jaw, disappearing into the gray stubble that covered his chin. But what General Holt did not know, what no one in that crowd of politicians and generals and decorated officers knew, was that in exactly 14 minutes he would be on his knees, and the name he would be begging forgiveness for was classified above his clearance level. "I asked you a question." Holt stopped 3 feet from the old man, close enough that everyone in the VIP section could hear, far enough to make clear the distance between them was more than physical. The old man straightened slightly when addressed, an almost imperceptible shift in his posture that spoke of decades of muscle memory. His eyes, a pale gray that seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it, met the general's gaze without flinching. "I knew the general being honored, sir. A long time ago." His voice was quiet, hoarse from disuse, but there was something underneath it. Something that did not match the torn jacket or the weathered boots, or the way he stood alone at the edge of respectability. Holt let out a short laugh, turning slightly to ensure his audience caught his expression of amused contempt. "You knew General Whitfield." He gestured broadly at the stage where the 3-star general sat waiting to receive his retirement honors, surrounded by 40 years of commendations and the accumulated dignity of a career spent in service. That General Whitfield, the one who commanded forces in Desert Storm, the one who rebuilt half of Iraq. "You knew him?" "Yes, sir." The simplicity of the response seemed to infuriate Holt more than any argument could have. He stepped closer, his voice rising to carry across the pavilion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this interruption. It seems we have a security breach." He snapped his fingers at 2 uniformed sergeants standing near the perimeter. "Remove this man. Now." The sergeant approached, one on each side. The younger one, a staff sergeant with combat infantry badges on his chest, reached for the old man's arm. The movement caused the worn field jacket to shift, and something metallic caught the afternoon light. Dog tags, 4 sets of them, hanging on a single chain against the old man's chest. Holt's eyes narrowed. "If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. You might just have a quiet legend in your own neighborhood, someone whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary story of service. Now, let us continue. Were those?" Holt pointed at the tags, his voice dripping with theatrical suspicion. He turned again to his audience, performing his outrage for maximum effect. 4 sets of dog tags. Let me guess. You bought them at a surplus store. Maybe stole them from a memorial somewhere. Do you know it is a federal offense to impersonate a service member?" The old man did not respond. His hand moved slowly, almost unconsciously, to touch the worn metal resting against his chest. His fingers, scarred and calloused in ways that spoke of work far more demanding than manual labor, traced the edges of the tags without looking at them. "I did not steal them, sir." "Then take them off." Holt's voice had gone cold. "Prove it. Show everyone here what name is on those tags. Because I guarantee you it will not match whatever story you are about to tell." For a long moment, the old man was silent. The crowd had gone quiet, sensing they were witnessing something beyond a simple security matter. The staff sergeant who had been reaching for the old man's arm had stopped, his hand frozen in midair. His eyes were fixed on something beneath the grime on the old man's forearm, visible where his sleeve had ridden up. Coordinates, a date, and 3 sets of initials surrounding a dagger. "With respect, sir." The old man's voice remained soft, but something in it had changed. A note of steel beneath the rust. "I would prefer not to remove them." Holt's face flushed red. "You would prefer?" He stepped forward until he was inches from the old man's face. I do not care what you prefer. You are disrupting an official military ceremony. You are trespassing on federal property. And you are almost certainly committing stolen valor. He jabbed a finger toward the exit. Leave now, or I will have you arrested. The old man did not move. His eyes had drifted past Holt, past the security sergeants, to the stage where General Raymond Whitfield sat in his dress uniform. For just a moment, something flickered across the old man's weathered face. Not anger, not fear, something that looked almost like grief. The staff sergeant released his grip on the old man's arm, as if it had burned him. His face had gone pale. Sir, he said to Holt, his voice barely above a whisper. Sir, I think we should wait. What? Holt spun on the young sergeant. I gave you an order. But across the pavilion, in the front row of VIP seating, an elderly man in a four-star general's uniform had risen from his chair. His face had gone the color of ash. His hands, which had commanded armies, were trembling, and he was walking directly toward them. The security sergeant's grip had loosened, but Elias Vaughn barely noticed. His mind had already begun to drift, pulled backward by currents stronger than the present moment. The smell of fresh-cut grass from the ceremony grounds had become something else. Junglehut, diesel fuel, the copper tang of blood that never quite washed out of memory, no matter how many years passed. He had not always been this. A ghost haunting the edges of ceremonies he had no right to attend. A man held together by duct tape and stubbornness and the quiet refusal to die before he was ready. There had been a time when he stood in formations like the one before him now, when his uniform bore the weight of ribbons and stars and the accumulated respect of men who knew what those symbols cost. There had been a time when he had a home, a wife who laughed at his terrible jokes and cried when he deployed and held him in the dark when the nightmares came. A daughter who looked at him like he could fix anything broken in the world. Margaret, her name still caught in his throat like a fish hook even after 8 years. He remembered the hospital room with its antiseptic smell and humming machines. He remembered holding her hand as she grew lighter, as the cancer consumed her from the inside the way fire consumes paper. He remembered her last words, "Stay with Catherine. Promise me." And he remembered the moment he broke that promise, walking out of their home 3 months after the funeral with nothing but his old field jacket and a letter he left on the kitchen table. I love you. I am sorry. Live your life. Do not look for me. He had watched his men die, held them as the light left their eyes, felt their blood soak through his fatigues, carried their dog tags against his heart for decades. He had survived things that should have killed him 100 times over. But watching Margaret fade, watching the same slow destruction take the woman who had anchored him to humanity for 30 years, that had broken something that could not be fixed. He could not sit in that house, surrounded by her photographs and her books and the ghost of her laughter. He could not look at Catherine without seeing Margaret's eyes staring back at him. He could not be the father she needed when he could barely remember how to be human. So he ran. The great Elias Vaughn, call sign Spectre, the man who had crawled through tunnels in Vietnam and jumped from helicopters into places that did not exist on any map, ran from grief he could not fight. The years since had blurred together. Shelters in winter when the cold became unbearable. Bridges and underpasses when pride refused to let him beg for a bed. The VA had lost his paperwork twice, and by the third attempt he had stopped trying. The system had no place for men like him. Men whose service records were sealed behind classification levels that most bureaucrats did not know existed. To the world, Elias Vaughn had died in 1983 in an operation that officially never happened. The man who walked out of a Cuban prison 3 months later, the man who had quietly returned to his wife and raised a daughter and never spoke of what he had done, that man did not exist in any database the VA could access. 3 months ago, the diagnosis had come. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctor had been young, kind, full of treatment options and survival statistics. Elias had listened politely, thanked him for his time, and walked out without scheduling a follow-up appointment. He had lived longer than he had any right to. Longer than Riley, who had been 23 with a pregnant wife. Longer than Webb, whose father and grandfather had both died in service before him. Longer than Okonkwo, who had wanted nothing more than to prove his family belonged in the country that had taken them in. He carried their tags still, every day, for 40 years. Their weight against his chest was the only prayer he knew how to speak anymore. The announcement had come through a newspaper left on a shelter cot. General Raymond Whitfield to receive retirement honors at Joint Base Andrews. 40 years of distinguished service. The name had struck him like a physical blow. Raymond, Ray, the young lieutenant, he had carried 2 miles through jungle with a bullet in his own shoulder, his hand clamped over the boy's mouth to keep his screams from giving away their position. The man who had lived because 3 others had died. The man who had gone on to command armies while Elias had faded into shadow. He had not planned to be seen. He never did. In the 12 years since leaving Catherine, he had attended every major moment of her life from the margins. Her wedding, watched from across the street as she walked into the church in white. Her promotion to department head, glimpsed through the windows of the university reception. He had become a professional ghost, haunting the lives of people he loved from distances that kept them safe from his wreckage. But today he had gotten too close. Today the pull of the past had been too strong. He had wanted to see Ray one more time, to look at the man he had saved and know that something good had come from that night in the jungle. To know that Riley and Webb and Okonkwo had not died for nothing. He had not expected the general with the polished shoes and the theatrical contempt. He had not expected to be dragged back into a world that had forgotten him, forced to choose between his silence and his dignity. And he had not expected to hear a voice. It cut through the crowd noise like a blade through fog. A voice he had not heard in 12 years, except in dreams. In the moments between waking and sleeping when his guard was down and memory became indistinguishable from reality. A voice that carried the same cadence as her mother's. The same music that had once made him believe he could be more than a weapon. Dad. The word hung in the air. The security sergeants froze. General Holt turned, confusion replacing contempt on his carefully composed face. And Elias Vaughn, the man who had survived prisons and jungles and the slow apocalypse of his own grief, felt his heart stop. Catherine stood 20 feet away, her hand pressed to her mouth. She was wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes. Her hair was shorter than he remembered, and beneath the flowing fabric of her dress, visible now that she had turned toward him, was the unmistakable curve of pregnancy. His daughter, his grandchild, standing in front of him for the first time in 12 years. And the look on her face was not anger. It was not hatred or betrayal or any of the things he had spent years telling himself he deserved. It was hope. The word hung between them like a hell breath. Dad, such a small word to carry so much weight. Elias could not move, could not speak, could not do anything but stare at the woman his daughter had become while he was busy disappearing from her life. General Holt recovered first. He stepped between Elias and Catherine, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man who sensed his authority slipping and refused to let it go. Ma'am, I do not know what this man has told you, but I assure you he is not who he claims to be. We have procedures for handling situations like this. His eyes swept the crowd, seeking allies, finding only confusion. Security, I want this man removed from the premises immediately. The staff sergeant who had frozen earlier did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Elias, on the tattoo barely visible beneath the grime, on the way the old man held himself even now. There was something in his expression that looked almost like fear. Not fear of the homeless man before him. Fear of making a mistake that could not be undone. I gave you an order, Sergeant. Holt's voice had risen half an octave, frustration bleeding through his composure. Sir. The young sergeant swallowed hard. Sir, with respect, I think we need to wait for clarification. Clarification. Holt laughed, but there was no humor in it. He gestured broadly at Elias, at his worn boots and patched jacket and the gray stubble covering his jaw. What clarification do you need? Look at him. This man is either mentally ill or running some kind of scam, and either way, he does not belong at a ceremony honoring one of the most decorated generals in modern military history. Catherine pushed past Holt as if he were furniture. She stopped 3 feet from her father, close enough that he could see the tears tracking down her cheeks, far enough that the 12 years between them remained visible in the space. Her hands were trembling. Her voice was not. "We'll look for you." Her words came out steady despite the tears. "For 3 years we looked. Private investigators. Missing persons reports. Nathan used every contact he had in naval intelligence." She took a shaky breath. "They told us you were probably dead. That men who disappear like you did usually end up in a river or a shallow grave somewhere." I almost believed them. Elias opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. What could he say? That he had watched her wedding from across the street. That he had seen her receive her doctorate through the windows of a university hall. That he had spent 12 years close enough to touch and too broken to reach out. Behind them, the ceremony had ground to a complete halt. General Whitfield had risen from his chair on the stage, his attention fixed on the commotion at the back of the pavilion. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as phones emerged from pockets and purses, cameras tracking toward the confrontation. Somewhere in the VIP section, a woman in a black dress with a gold star pin on her lapel had stood, her eyes locked on Elias with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the chaos. Holt was losing his audience, and he knew it. He stepped forward, positioning himself in front of the cameras, his voice rising to address the crowd as much as the participants. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this disruption. This man will be removed, and the ceremony will continue as planned." He turned to the security sergeants, his patience exhausted. "That was not a request. Remove him now, or I will have you both court-martialed for insubordination." The older sergeant, a master sergeant with a ranger scroll on his shoulder, finally moved. He stepped toward Elias, his hand extended not to grab but to guide. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice pitched for Elias alone. "Sir, maybe it is best if we step aside and sort this out privately, before this gets any more complicated." Elias looked at the master sergeant, looked at the ranger scroll, looked at the combat patches that marked him as someone who had seen the same darkness, walked the same shadows. For a moment, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the silent language of men who had done things that could not be spoken aloud. "I just wanted to see him." Elias's voice came out barely above a whisper. "One last time. I was not going to cause any trouble." Holt heard him and pounced. "See him." He let out a theatrical scoff, playing to the cameras now openly recording the exchange. "You wanted to see General Whitfield. And what exactly was your relationship with him? Were you his driver? His cook? Maybe you shined his boots 40 years ago, and now you think that entitles you to crash his retirement ceremony." Catherine stepped forward, her voice cutting through Holt's mockery. "General, I would advise you to stop talking." Her tone had shifted, professional and cold, the voice of a woman who had spent years navigating institutional politics. "My father served this country in ways that you cannot begin to understand. The fact that you do not know who he is says far more about your clearance level than his service record." Holt's face flushed red. "Your father." He looked at Elias, then at Catherine, then back again. His lip curled. "Lady, I do not know what kind of delusion you are operating under, but this man is a homeless vagrant who wandered in off the street. Whatever stories he has told you, whatever claims he has made, I can assure you they are fantasies." Across the pavilion, the four-star general had nearly reached them. His progress had been slowed by the crowd, by the press of bodies, and the questions shouted in his direction. But he was close now, close enough that Elias could see his face clearly for the first time. General Arthur Mercer. They had served together in Vietnam, back when Mercer was a young captain and Elias was already becoming something that did not have a name in any official document. They had not spoken in decades, but some connections transcended time. Mercer's eyes met Elias's across the chaos. And in that moment, Elias saw recognition bloom across the old general's face. Recognition and something else. Something that looked like reverence. The master sergeant saw it too. He released Elias's arm and took a step back, his posture shifting subtly. Whatever was about to happen, he wanted no part of being on the wrong side of it. "General Holt." Mercer's voice carried the authority of 50 years in uniform and the command of armies across 3 continents. His tone was quiet, but it silenced every other sound in the pavilion. Step away from that man. Now. Holt spun, confusion and irritation warring on his face. General Mercer, with all due respect, I am handling a security situation here. This man has no credentials, no invitation, no business being anywhere near this ceremony. He has been disrupting proceedings and making wild claims about knowing General Whitfield, and I am simply trying to restore order. Mercer stopped 5 feet from them. His eyes had not left Elias. His hands, which had signed orders that sent thousands into battle, were shaking. Marcus. His voice was barely above a whisper. I served with this man's unit in Vietnam. I was a captain. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked on the words. He was already a legend. Legend. The words seemed to freeze Holt in place, his mouth half open around a response that never came. Mercer did not look at him. His attention remained fixed on Elias with the intensity of a man seeing a ghost made flesh. But Elias was no longer in the pavilion. The word had triggered something, pulled loose a thread that dragged him backward through 40 years of carefully constructed walls. He was standing in jungle darkness, the air thick with humidity and the copper smell of blood. He was 29 years old and watching his world come apart. October 25th, 1983. Point Salines, Grenada. The official history books would record Operation Urgent Fury as a swift American victory, a liberation of medical students, a message sent to Soviet ambitions in the Caribbean. None of those books would mention the 4-man team that had inserted 48 hours before the main invasion. None of them would mention the compound 12 miles from the beach where CIA assets sat in a concrete cell, waiting for extraction or execution, whichever came first. Elias had led that team. Sergeant First Class Thomas Riley on point, the best tracker he had ever worked with. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, running communications, third-generation special forces with his father's challenge coin sewn into his vest. Sergeant Victor Okonkwo on rear security, the quietest operator Elias had ever known and the deadliest with a blade in close quarters. And attached to them, for forward observation, a young lieutenant fresh from Ranger School named Raymond Whitfield, eager and green and convinced that his training had prepared him for what was coming. It had not. Nothing could have. The intelligence had been wrong. They had walked into an ambush in the dark, muzzle flashes erupting from positions that were supposed to be empty. Riley had gone down first, taking rounds meant for the lieutenant he had pushed out of the line of fire. Webb had called for extraction that would never come, his radio shattered by the same burst that opened his chest. Okonkwo had held the left flank alone for 11 minutes, buying time with his life, his final transmission a single word. Go! Elias had grabbed the lieutenant with one hand and the asset with the other. He had run, through jungle that tore at his skin, through darkness split by tracer fire, through the moment when a round punched through his shoulder, and he kept moving because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing the men who had already given everything. 2 miles. He had carried Whitfield 2 miles with a bullet lodged against his scapula, his hand clamped over the young man's mouth, every time a patrol passed close enough to hear breathing. The asset had stumbled along beside them, clutching documents that would later reveal Soviet plans to position nuclear submarines in Cuban waters. Documents that would change the trajectory of the Cold War. Documents that no one outside a classified briefing room would ever know existed. They had reached the extraction point at dawn. The helicopter had lifted off under fire, the door gunner laying down suppression while Elias bled into the deck plates. He remembered the medic's face, young and terrified, hands moving frantically to plug holes that kept opening. He remembered the pilot's voice crackling through his fading consciousness. We're not going to make it to the carrier. Diverting to field hospital. He did not remember the next 3 months. They told him later that he had died twice on the operating table, that his heart had stopped and been restarted, his body refusing to surrender, even when his mind had already gone dark. They told him that by the time he woke in a military hospital in Panama, he had already been declared killed in action. His wife had been notified. His daughter, only 8 years old, had attended a memorial service for a father who was not dead. The agency had wanted to keep it that way. The operation did not exist. The asset did not exist. The intelligence that had prevented a nuclear confrontation in the Caribbean did not exist. And the man who had carried it all out of the jungle, the man who had lost 3 brothers and nearly his own life, he could not exist either. They had offered him a new identity, a quiet retirement, a pension that would arrive from Shell Company with no traceable origin. He had refused. He had gone home to Margaret, to Catherine, to the life he had almost lost. He had never spoken of what happened in Grenada. Not to his wife, not to his daughter, not to anyone. He had carried the weight alone because that was what the mission required, and the mission never ended. Not really, not ever. The tags around his neck held the proof. Riley, Webb, Okonkwo, their names etched in metal, their blood long since worn away by decades of contact with his skin. He had promised them, in those final moments, that he would not let them be forgotten, that he would carry them with him until his own ending came, that their sacrifice would mean something even if no one else ever knew. 40 years. 40 years of silence. 40 years of watching Raymond Whitfield rise through the ranks, become the general that Elias's men had died to create. 40 years of wondering if it had been worth it, if the intelligence had really mattered, if the world had been saved, or if they had simply delayed an inevitable reckoning. And now he stood in a ceremony pavilion with his daughter's tears on his conscience and a general's accusation ringing in his ears, and the weight of those 40 years threatened to drive him to his knees. The sound of Holt's voice snapped him back to the present. Legend. The word came out sharp, disbelieving. Holt had recovered enough to form sentences, though his confidence had cracked visibly around the edges. General Mercer, I do not know what you think you remember, but this man is clearly disturbed. Whatever unit you are thinking of, I can assure you this vagrant was not part of it. Mercer finally turned to look at Holt. The contempt in his eyes was surgical. General Holt, I have known you for 15 years. You have never seen combat. You have never held a dying man in your arms. You have never made a decision that cost lives or saved them. He stepped closer to Elias, his voice dropping. I watched this man walk out of the jungle, carrying a wounded officer on his back with a bullet in his shoulder and 3 dead teammates behind him. I was the captain who signed the initial after-action report that was immediately classified above my clearance level. He paused, his eyes glistening. I thought he died in 1983. Everyone thought he died. Elias met the old general's gaze. Arthur, he said quietly, it has been a long time. Mercer's composure finally broke. A sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sob. 40 years. His voice cracked. 40 years I have carried your name in my prayers. 40 years I have told your story to every young officer who thought they understood sacrifice. And you have been alive this whole time. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the cameras had stopped their mechanical clicking. The only sound was the wind moving through the flags overhead, the fabric snapping in a rhythm that sounded almost like heartbeats, or like gunfire, if you had spent enough years learning to hear the difference. The silence stretched across the pavilion like a held breath. Holt stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions too fast to name. Confusion, disbelief, the first cold tendrils of fear as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Catherine had not moved. Her hand still hovered near her mouth, tears still tracking down her cheeks, but her eyes had changed. The hope that had flickered there moments ago had deepened into something else. Understanding. The pieces of a puzzle she had spent her entire life trying to solve were finally clicking into place. A woman emerged from the VIP section, moving with purpose through the stunned crowd. She wore the crisp uniform of a Navy commander, her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to crisis and trained to respond. Commander Sarah Chun stopped beside Elias, her eyes taking in his pallor, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he swayed almost imperceptibly on his feet. "Sir." Her voice was calm, professional, pitched to cut through the chaos without adding to it. "Sir, you do not look well. May I help you to a seat?" Elias turned to look at her. For a moment, he saw only the uniform, the rank insignia, the careful neutrality of someone trained to manage situations. Then he noticed the small pin on her lapel, nearly hidden beneath her ribbons. A purple heart with a black border. The symbol of her own veteran reintegration program, the one she ran for combat veterans who had fallen through the cracks of official support systems. "I am fine." The words came out automatically, the reflexive deflection of a man who had spent decades refusing help. She did not argue. She simply remained beside him, a steady presence that asked nothing and offered everything. Her eyes moved briefly to Mercer, a question passing between them in the silent language of those who had learned to communicate without words. The master sergeant who had released Elias earlier stepped forward. He had been watching the exchange with growing intensity, his hand unconsciously touching the ranger scroll on his shoulder. "Sir," he said to Mercer, his voice carrying the weight of something he needed to say. "Sir, that tattoo on his arm. The coordinates. I have seen those markings before. At Bragg. On the memorial wall in the compound that does not officially exist." Mercer nodded slowly. "You serve with the unit." "I serve with men who spoke of the unit, sir." The sergeant's voice dropped. They spoke of an operator whose call sign was Spectre. A man who went into places that could not be named and came out carrying ghosts. He looked at Elias. They said he died saving a lieutenant in Grenada. That he held a position alone for hours so others could escape. That his last transmission was coordinates for extraction that he never reached. The word rippled through the crowd. Spectre, whispered from mouth to mouth like a prayer or a legend, which in some circles amounted to the same thing. An elderly man in the VIP section, his chest heavy with ribbons from conflicts spanning 5 decades, removed his cover and held it over his heart. On the stage, General Raymond Whitfield had risen from his chair. His face had gone pale beneath the ceremony lights, his eyes fixed on the commotion at the back of the pavilion with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something beyond the physical scene before him. He was seeing jungle darkness. He was seeing muzzle flashes. He was seeing the face of the man who had carried him to safety while bleeding from a wound that should have killed him. Holt made one last attempt to salvage his authority. "General Mercer, even if this man is who you believe him to be, he is clearly unwell." He gestured at Elias with something approaching desperation. "Look at him. He is homeless. He is confused. Whatever service he may have rendered decades ago, he is in no condition to be present at an official military function. The compassionate thing would be to have him taken somewhere he can receive proper care." Catherine stepped forward, her voice cutting through Holt's rationalization like a blade. The compassionate thing. She moved to stand beside her father, her hand finding his for the first time in 12 years. The compassionate thing would have been to listen before you judged, to ask before you accused, to consider for one moment that the world might contain truths beyond your understanding. Elias felt his daughter's fingers intertwine with his own. Her hand was warm, strong, the hand of a woman who had built a life without him, who had succeeded despite his absence, who had every right to hate him and had chosen something else instead. He squeezed gently, afraid that if he held too tight she might disappear, that this might all dissolve into another dream from which he would wake alone on a shelter cot. The crowd parted as a figure approached from the stage. General Whitfield walked slowly, his dress uniform immaculate, his medals catching the afternoon light. His eyes never left Elias. Each step brought him closer to a confrontation 40 years in the making, a debt that could never truly be repaid. Chen leaned close to Elias, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, whatever happens next, you should know that you're not alone. My program exists for men like you. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, just a door that stays open whenever you're ready to walk through it." Elias did not respond. His attention had fixed on Whitfield's approaching figure, on the face of the young lieutenant he had saved, now weathered by decades of command and responsibility. He thought of Riley and Webb and Okonkwo. He thought of the promise he had made to carry them, to remember them, to ensure their deaths had meaning. He thought of Margaret, whose final wish he had betrayed. He thought of Catherine, whose childhood he had abandoned. He thought of the granddaughter growing in her womb, a life he might never see born. 3 months. The doctors had given him 3 months. Maybe less. The cancer was eating him from the inside the way grief had eaten him for years. He had come here expecting to watch from the shadows, to see Whitfield one last time, to slip away before anyone noticed the ghost in the worn field jacket. Instead, he stood in the center of a storm he had not anticipated, his secrets peeling away layer by layer, his carefully constructed invisibility dissolving in the light of recognition. Whitfield stopped 10 feet away. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. He tried again, and this time the word came out broken, barely audible, carrying the weight of 4 decades of guilt and gratitude and the particular anguish of a man who had lived while others died. Spectre. The name hung in the air between them. And somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera captured the moment General Raymond Whitfield, hero of 3 wars and commander of armies, fell to his knees and wept. The sound that escaped General Whitfield was not a word. It was something older, something that came from a place beyond language. His knees hit the stone pathway with a crack that echoed across the silent pavilion, and his shoulders began to shake with sobs that 40 years of military discipline could not contain. Elias moved before he could think. The instinct was older than his pain, older than his grief, older than the cancer eating through his organs. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and dropped to one knee beside the weeping general, his hand finding Whitfield's shoulder with the same steadiness that had guided that hand through jungles and firefights and the long darkness of a Cuban prison cell. "Ray." His voice was quiet, meant only for the man before him. "Ray, get up. You are a general. Your people are watching." Whitfield looked up, his face wet with tears, his eyes carrying a devastation that time had not diminished. "I left you." The words came out ragged, torn from somewhere deep. "I left you in that jungle. They told me you were dead, that there was nothing I could have done, but I knew. I knew you were still alive when that helicopter lifted off. I felt it, and I left you anyway. You were wounded. You would have died. They died." Whitfield's voice cracked on the words. "Riley, Webb, Okonkwo. They died, and I lived, and you carried me out, and I have spent 40 years trying to be worthy of that. 40 years of command, of responsibility, of sending other men into places they might not return from. And every single time, every single mission, I see their faces. I see your face. I see you standing in that clearing, telling me to go, telling me you would hold them off." Elias closed his eyes. The memory was there, vivid as yesterday. The moment when extraction had arrived, and there was only room for 2. The moment when he had made the choice that haunted every night since. Take the lieutenant and the asset. I will find another way out. There had been no other way out. He had known that even as he said the words. He had known he was choosing to die so that Whitfield could live, so that the intelligence could reach Washington, so that the sacrifice of his team would mean something. The fact that he had survived, that the Cubans had taken him alive, that the agency had eventually negotiated his release, none of that changed the fundamental calculus of that moment. He had chosen death. Death had simply refused to take him. The crowd had drawn closer, a ring of witnesses to a reunion that defied explanation. Phones continued to record, capturing every moment of the general's breakdown and the homeless man's gentle response. Somewhere in the mass of spectators, the woman with the gold star pin had pressed her hand to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. Catherine stood frozen where Elias had left her, watching her father comfort a 3-star general as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Beside her, a man in navy dress whites had appeared, his commander's insignia gleaming in the afternoon light. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his own face pale with shock. "That is your father." Commander Nathan Ellis spoke the words like a question, though they were not. His voice carried the particular weight of someone whose professional training had just collided with personal revelation. "Catherine, that is your father, the one you said disappeared, the one you thought might be dead." Catherine could not answer. She could only watch as the man she had spent 12 years grieving knelt beside a weeping general and spoke words too soft to hear, his scarred hand steady on the shoulder of a man who had commanded armies. Holt had retreated several steps, his face ashen. The political calculus was already running behind his eyes, the damage assessment, the career implications, the impossibility of recovering from what he had done in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras. He had tried to arrest a legend. He had mocked a hero. He had demanded the removal of dog tags that carried more weight than every ribbon on his chest combined. General Mercer approached the two kneeling figures, his own composure barely holding. He stopped beside them and slowly, deliberately, raised his hand to his brow in a salute that trembled with emotion. Around the pavilion, others followed. The master sergeant with the ranger scroll, the elderly veteran who had removed his cover, a young captain in the third row whose father had served in special operations. One by one, then in clusters, then in a wave that swept across the entire assembly, hands rose to foreheads in tribute to the man in the worn field jacket. Elias looked up at the sea of saluting figures and felt something crack inside his chest. It was not the cancer. It was not the exhaustion or the hunger or the years of sleeping on concrete. It was something he had walled away so long ago that he had forgotten it existed. The need to be seen, the need to be acknowledged, the need to know that the sacrifices had mattered, that the deaths had meant something, that the silence he had carried for 4 decades had served some purpose beyond his own isolation. He rose slowly, his knees protesting the movement, his body reminding him of all the ways it was failing. Whitfield rose with him, one hand gripping Elias's arm for support. They stood together in the center of the pavilion, two old men bound by blood and memory and the particular anguish of survivors. "Ray." Elias's voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I did not come here for this. I came to see you one more time, to tell you that what you have built, what you have done with the life we bought you, it was worth it. Riley and Webb and Okonkwo, they would be proud of the man you became." Whitfield's grip tightened on his arm. "And what about you? What did you do with the life you kept?" Elias thought of Margaret, dying in a hospital bed while he held her hand. He thought of Catherine, growing up without a father who could explain where he went or what he did. He thought of the shelters and the bridges and the long nights when the only company he had was the weight of dog tags against his chest and the whispered names of men who would never grow old. "I survived." The word came out hollow. "I'm not sure that is the same thing as living." Catherine's voice cut through the moment, sharp with something between anger and desperate love. "Then start." She pushed through the crowd until she stood before him, her pregnant belly a reminder of futures he had not allowed himself to imagine. "Start living. Right now. Today. You do not get to disappear again. You do not get to watch from the shadows while your grandchild grows up without knowing you." Elias looked at his daughter, at the tears on her face, at the fierce determination in her eyes that reminded him so much of Margaret it made his chest ache. "Catherine." His voice broke on her name. "I am dying." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. The word dying hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Catherine's face went white. Her hand flew to her stomach in an instinctive gesture of protection, as if the word itself might harm the child growing inside her. "What do you mean, dying?" Her voice came out strangled, barely recognizable. "What do you mean?" Elias looked at his daughter and saw Margaret. The same fierce eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw, the same refusal to accept defeat even when the odds were impossible. He had spent 12 years running from that face, and now it stood before him demanding answers he did not want to give. Pancreatic cancer. The clinical term felt strange on his tongue, too clean for the reality of what was happening inside him. Stage 4. Diagnosed 3 months ago. He paused, watching the information register on her face like successive blows. "They offered treatment. I declined. You declined." Nathan stepped forward, his naval officer's composure cracking around the edges. "You have cancer and you declined treatment. Treatment would have given me 6 months of pain and weakness instead of 3 months of something resembling life." Elias's voice was steady, the voice of a man who had made peace with his decision long before this moment. "I did not want to spend my last days in a hospital bed attached to machines. I wanted to spend them remembering, saying goodbye to the places and people that mattered. Catherine's tears had stopped. Something harder had taken their place, something that burned like cold fire in her eyes. So you came here, to watch a ceremony from the shadows, to see General Whitfield one last time. Her voice rose with each sentence. But not to see me, not to meet your grandchild, not to give us a chance to say goodbye. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. He had no defense against it because there was no defense. He had planned to die alone, to slip away as quietly as he had lived these past 12 years, to spare his daughter the burden of watching another parent fade. He had told himself it was kindness. Standing here now, seeing the devastation on her face, he understood it was cowardice. I thought it would be easier. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. For you, if I just disappeared, if you never had to watch me go the way I watched your mother. Easier. Catherine's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. You thought it would be easier for me to spend the rest of my life wondering if you died in a ditch somewhere. Wondering if I could have saved you if I'd looked harder, tried more, never given up. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea what these 12 years have been like? Do you have any idea how many times I woke up in the middle of the night hoping you were still alive, terrified that you were suffering somewhere and I was not there to help? Elias reached for her hand. She pulled back, and a rejection cut deeper than any wound he had ever suffered. Commander Chun moved quietly to his side. Sir, she said softly, this might not be the place for this conversation. There is no other place. Catherine's voice had gone cold. There is no other time. He is dying. In 3 months he will be gone, and I will have spent 12 years without him, and whatever time we have left gets eaten by secrets and silence. She turned to face her father fully, her shoulders squared like a soldier preparing for battle. So no, we are having this conversation now, right here, in front of everyone. Whitfield had not released his grip on Elias's arm. The general stood beside him like a pillar, his own face still wet with tears, his presence a silent declaration of solidarity. Whatever judgment was coming, Elias would not face it alone. The crowd had drawn even closer, the circle of witnesses tightening around the drama unfolding at its center. Phones continued to record, but the people holding them had lowered them slightly, as if sensing that what they were witnessing had crossed from spectacle into something sacred. Tell me. Catherine's voice cracked despite her efforts to keep it steady. Tell me why you left. Tell me what was so broken inside you that you thought abandoning your daughter was better than staying. Elias closed his eyes. He saw Margaret in the hospital bed, her hand growing cold in his. He saw the funeral, standing at the edge of the crowd because he could not bear to sit in the front row where everyone could see him shatter. He saw Catherine at the reception afterward, 18 years old and trying to be strong for everyone else, and he saw himself, watching from across the room, already planning his escape. Your mother was my anchor. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by years of silence. She was the only person who knew what I'd done, who I really was, and loved me anyway. She was the reason I came home, the reason I stayed, the reason I learned how to be something other than a weapon. He opened his eyes and looked at his daughter. When she died, I lost the only person who could hold me to the earth. And every time I looked at you, I saw her face, her eyes, her smile, and it destroyed me. Every single time. I was not strong enough to carry that weight. So I ran. Catherine's composure finally broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and her hand found his before she could stop herself. Her fingers were warm and strong and alive, gripping him with a ferocity that spoke of years of waiting for this moment. You stupid, stubborn, broken man. Her voice was thick with tears. You could have told me. You could have let me help you carry it. Elias felt something give way inside him. A wall he had built so long ago, he had forgotten it was there. A dam holding back decades of grief and guilt and the terrible loneliness of a man who had convinced himself he did not deserve to be loved. I know. The words came out broken. I know. And I am sorry. I am so sorry. Catherine pulled him into an embrace. Her arms wrapped around him with a strength that surprised him, and he felt her belly press against his, felt the flutter of movement within. his grandchild, his daughter, holding him for the first time in 12 years. He had come here expecting to watch from the shadows, to see Whitfield one last time and then fade away, to die alone, as he had lived alone, carrying his secrets to a grave that no one would visit. Instead, he stood in the center of a pavilion surrounded by witnesses, his arms full of his daughter, his secrets scattered like leaves in the wind. There was no going back to the shadows now. There was only forward, into whatever time remained. 3 months, maybe less, but he would not spend them alone. The embrace lasted longer than any mission briefing, longer than any extraction, longer than the 14 hours Elias had once spent pinned in a collapsed tunnel waiting for rescue that might never come. When Catherine finally pulled back, her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes held something new. Not forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness would take time, but the door to it had opened, and that was more than he had dared to hope for. General Holt chose that moment to attempt his rehabilitation. He stepped forward, his face arranged in an expression of careful contrition that looked rehearsed even as he delivered it. "Sir, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding. If I had known who you were, obviously my approach would have been different. Perhaps we could discuss this privately and find a way to move forward that benefits everyone." The words landed in the silence like a counterfeit coin on a marble floor. Everyone heard the falseness in them. Everyone saw the calculation behind the apology. Holt was not sorry for what he had done. He was sorry that there were consequences. Whitfield turned to face him, and the transformation was remarkable. The weeping man who had fallen to his knees moments ago had vanished. In his place stood the general who had commanded troops in 3 wars, whose orders had shaped battlefields across 2 continents, whose displeasure could end careers with a single phone call. General Holt. Whitfield's voice carried the cold precision of artillery fire. "You attempted to have a decorated combat veteran arrested for trespassing at my retirement ceremony. You publicly accused him of stolen valor. You demanded he remove his dog tags, tags that carry the names of 3 men who died, so that I could stand here today." He paused, letting each word land with its full weight. "And you did all of this without taking 30 seconds to ask a single question about who he might actually be." Holt's face had gone the color of old paper. "General Whitfield, I was simply following security protocols. There was no way I could have known. There was every way." Whitfield cut him off. "You could have asked. You could have listened. You could have looked at the way he stood, the way he carried himself, the unit patch on his jacket that any operator worth his salt would have recognized." He stepped closer to Holt, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "But you did not want to know. You wanted to perform. You wanted to demonstrate your authority in front of cameras and dignitaries. You saw a homeless man, and you saw an opportunity to look powerful." The crowd had gone absolutely still. Phones that had lowered during Catherine's confrontation with her father had risen again, capturing every moment of a general's career disintegrating in real time. General Mercer moved to stand beside Whitfield, presenting a united front of 4 stars worth of condemnation. "Marcus, I have known you for 15 years. Watched you climb the ranks through political maneuvering and strategic positioning. You have never led troops in combat, never made a decision under fire, never held a dying soldier in your arms and promised him that his sacrifice would mean something." His voice hardened. "Men like Elias Vaughn are the reason men like you can play soldier at ceremony grounds. And you just try to throw him out like garbage." Holt's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He looked around the pavilion, searching for allies, finding only faces that had turned away. The political instincts that had served him so well for decades were screaming at him to cut his losses, to retreat, to begin damage control. But there was no controlling this damage. The cameras had captured everything. The witnesses numbered in hundreds. By tomorrow, every military blog and news outlet in the country would be running the story. Elias watched the man who had tried to humiliate him collapse under the weight of judgment he had brought upon himself. There was a time when he might have felt satisfaction at the sight, a time when the warrior in him would have relished the enemy's defeat. But that warrior was tired now. That warrior was dying, and revenge had never tasted as sweet as the stories made it sound. "General Holt, His voice cut through the tension, quiet but carrying. Everyone turned to look at the homeless man in the worn field jacket, the legend who had emerged from shadows, the ghost who had refused to stay dead. You did not know, Elias continued, his words measured and deliberate. There was no way you could have known. The things I did, the people I served with, the missions we ran, none of it exists in any file you have access to. The tags I wore look like costume jewelry to anyone who has not earned the right to recognize them. He paused, meeting Holt's eyes directly. You made assumptions based on what you saw. That is a human failing. I have made the same mistake myself, more times than I care to admit. The crowd shifted, uncertain. This was not the condemnation they had expected. This was not the righteous destruction of a man who had humiliated a hero. Elias took a slow breath, feeling the cancer twist in his gut, a reminder that time was a luxury he no longer possessed. But I will tell you what I told myself every time I made that mistake. What you do next matters more than what you did before. You can spend the rest of your career defending this moment, explaining it away, pretending it did not happen. Or you can let it change you, let it make you better. Let it teach you that the measure of a person is not in their appearance or their circumstances, but in the content of their character and the weight of their service. He stepped closer to Holt, close enough that his next words would not be picked up by the phone microphones. Every veteran you see on these streets, every man or woman in worn clothes with haunted eyes, remember today. Remember that you nearly arrested a man who prevented World War III. And ask yourself who else you might be walking past without a second glance. Holt stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and something that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of shame. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood there, receiving a lesson he had never expected to learn, delivered by a man he had tried to destroy. Whitfield placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. You always were too forgiving. His voice was rough with emotion. Riley would have wanted to see him burn. Elias shook his head slowly. Riley would have wanted to see him learn. There's a difference. He turned away from Holt, away from the crowd, away from the cameras and the judgment and the chaos he had never intended to cause. His eyes found Catherine, still standing where he had left her, her hand resting on her belly, her face wet with tears that had not stopped flowing. I believe. Whitfield's voice rose to address the crowd, command returning to his tone, that my retirement ceremony has taken an unexpected turn. He paused, something like a smile ghosting across his weathered face. And I cannot imagine a more fitting tribute to my career than the return of the man who made it possible. He turned to face Elias fully, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the pavilion with the weight of 40 years of gratitude. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to Master Sergeant Elias Vaughn, call sign Spectre, the man who carried me out of hell. The name echoed across the pavilion like a bell tolling across decades of silence. Master Sergeant Elias Vaughn, call sign Spectre. The words transformed the homeless man in the worn field jacket into something else entirely. Not a vagrant, not a trespasser, a legend made flesh, standing before them in boots held together by determination and nothing else. Whitfield gestured toward the stage, toward the podium where he had been prepared to accept the accolades of a career spanning 40 years. If you will permit me a change in program, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the pavilion. This ceremony was meant to honor my service, but my service exists only because of the men who made it possible. 3 of them died in a jungle that officially does not exist. One of them stands before you now. He turned to Elias, extending his hand, not in greeting, but in invitation. Will you join me, old friend? There are names that deserve to be spoken aloud, stories that have waited long enough to be told. Elias hesitated. For 40 years he had lived in shadow, had carried his secrets like stones in his pockets, had let the world believe he was dead rather than face the weight of recognition. The stage before him represented everything he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Visibility, acknowledgement, the terrible vulnerability of being seen. Catherine's voice reached him from somewhere behind. Go, Dad. Her words were soft but steady. Let them know who you are. Let them know who you were. He looked at his daughter, at the tears still wet on her face, at the life growing inside her, at the future he had nearly missed entirely. Then he looked at Whitfield, at the young lieutenant he had carried through darkness, now standing in the light of a career built on the foundation of that night in Grenada. Elias walked toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from weakness but from the weight of what he was about to do. He was about to break 40 years of silence. He was about to speak names that had never been spoken publicly. He was about to acknowledge, for the first time, what the mission had cost and what it had meant. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship. He saw faces turning, phones rising, but none of it registered. His focus had narrowed to the stage, to the podium, to the moment when everything he had buried would finally see daylight. Whitfield met him at the steps and offered his arm for support. Elias accepted it, not because his body required the assistance, but because the gesture meant something. Brothers in arms, leaning on each other across the decades that separated who they had been from who they had become. They reached the podium together. Whitfield stepped to the microphone first, his command presence filling the space as naturally as breathing. 40 years ago, I was a young lieutenant attached to a special operations team for a mission I was not prepared to understand. His voice carried across the pavilion, reaching every corner, every ear, every recording device. I thought I knew what war was. I thought my training had prepared me for what we would face. I was wrong. He paused, his eyes finding Elias beside him. The team leader was a man named Elias Vaughn, call sign Spectre. Even then, before Grenada, his reputation was legend in circles that do not officially exist. Men whispered his name in the same breath as missions that changed the course of history. I was terrified of him. A ripple of something like laughter moved through the crowd, but it died quickly. The weight of what was coming silenced any levity. We inserted 48 hours before the main invasion. Our objective was the extraction of an intelligence asset whose information would alter the trajectory of the Cold War. The mission was classified above any level I had clearance for. I was there only as a forward observer, a set of eyes attached to a team of warriors whose capabilities I could barely comprehend. Whitfield's voice cracked, and he paused to compose himself. What happened next is something I have never spoken of publicly. Not because it was classified, though it was, but because speaking of it meant acknowledging a debt I can never repay. He turned to Elias, and the pain in his eyes was visible even from the back of the pavilion. We walked into an ambush. Intelligence failures. Positions that were supposed to be clear were full of enemy fighters. The team, for men who had trained together for years, who trusted each other with their lives, they did what operators do. They fought. Elias stepped forward, his hand finding the podium's edge for support. His voice, when it came, was quieter than Whitfield's, but carried the same weight. Sergeant First Class Thomas Riley. He spoke the name like a prayer. Point man. Best tracker I ever worked with. Married 3 weeks before deployment. His wife was pregnant. He took the rounds meant for Lieutenant Whitfield, pushed him clear, and caught the burst in his chest. Dead before he hit the ground. The pavilion had gone completely silent. Not a whisper, not a shuffle. Even a wind seemed to have stilled. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb. Elias continued, each name costing him something visible. Communications. 3rd generation Special Forces. His father died in Vietnam. His grandfather in Korea. The same burst that killed Riley shattered his radio and opened his chest. He bled out calling for extraction that would never come in time. Catherine had moved closer to the stage, Nathan's arm around her shoulders. Her face was wet with tears, but she did not look away. She was finally learning who her father had been, who he still was. Sergeant Victor Okonkwo. Elias's voice broke on the name. Rear Security. 1st generation American. His parents came from Nigeria with nothing and raised a son who wanted to prove he belonged. He held the left flank alone for 11 minutes against a force that outnumbered him 4-1. His last transmission was a single word. Go. The weight of the names settled over the crowd like a physical presence. These were not statistics, not entries in a classified file. They were men, sons and husbands and friends, warriors who had given everything so that others might live. Elias looked out at the sea of faces before him. Some were crying openly. Others stood rigid, military bearing barely containing the emotion beneath. He saw the woman with the gold star pin, her hand pressed to her heart. He saw the master sergeant with the ranger scroll, his salute still raised. He saw his daughter, finally understanding the weight her father had carried in silence for her entire life. They died so that Lieutenant Whitfield and the asset could escape. His voice steadied, the soldier in him taking over. The intelligence that asset carried prevented a Soviet nuclear submarine from reaching Cuban waters. It changed the course of history. But that is not why they died. He paused, letting the silence stretch. They died because they were warriors, because they knew what the mission meant, because when the moment came to choose between their own survival and the lives of others, they chose others. That is what sacrifice means. That is what service means. That is what these tags around my neck represent. He lifted the dog tags, the metal catching the afternoon light. For sets of names, for souls bound together by blood and memory and the particular anguish of those who survive. I have carried them for 40 years. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but the microphone caught every word. I will carry them until the day I die. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Not the uncomfortable silence of a crowd unsure how to respond, but the sacred silence of a congregation in the presence of something holy. The dog tags caught the light as Elias lowered them back against his chest, for sets of names returning to their place over his heart. Then the woman with the gold star pin began to move. She rose from her seat in the VIP section, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving Elias's face. The crowd parted for her as it had parted for him, recognizing in her bearing the particular gravity of loss that transcends rank and circumstance. She reached the base of the stage and stopped. Her voice, when it came, was surprisingly strong for a woman who appeared to be in her 80s. My name is Eleanor Riley. Her words carried across the pavilion with perfect clarity. Thomas Riley was my son. Elias felt the world tilt beneath him. 40 years he had carried Tommy's tags. 40 years he had visited the wall where his name was not written because the mission did not exist. 40 years he had whispered apologies to a ghost, never knowing if those apologies reached anyone who could receive them. And now Tommy's mother stood before him, alive, present, waiting. He descended the stage steps without conscious thought, his body moving on instincts older than strategy or caution. He stopped in front of Eleanor Riley and found he could not speak. The words that had flowed so easily moments before had dried up, leaving only the terrible weight of a debt that could never be repaid. Eleanor reached up and touched his face. Her fingers were cool and dry, tracing the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. You were there. Her voice cracked on the words. You were with him when he died. Elias nodded. The motion felt inadequate, meaningless against the magnitude of what she was asking. Tell me. Her eyes held his with an intensity that would not permit evasion. Tell me how my son died. He had told the story to generals and intelligence officers, to debriefers and analysts, to the cold machinery of classification that had swallowed the mission whole. But he had never told it to a mother. He had never spoken the words to someone who had held Tommy as an infant, who had watched him take his first steps, who had sent him off to war and waited for a knock on the door that would end her world. He took her hands in his. They felt fragile, bird-boned, but her grip was fierce. He saved Lieutenant Whitfield's life. Elias's voice came out rough, scraped raw by the effort of forming each word. We were taking fire from a position we had cleared twice. Tommy saw the muzzle flash before I did. He pushed the lieutenant out of the line of fire and took the burst himself. Eleanor's eyes closed, tears escaping down the weathered channels of her cheeks. Was it quick? Yes. The lie came easily because it was also the truth. The burst had been devastating, but Tommy had been gone before his body hit the jungle floor. There had been no lingering, no suffering, no slow fade into darkness. He had been alive, and then he had not. It is quick. He did not suffer. She opened her eyes. And you carried him out. I carried his tags. I cannot carry his body. The admission cost him something he had never acknowledged before. The weight of leaving Tommy's remains in that jungle, of running when every instinct screamed at him to stay, to fight, to die beside his men. I had to choose between bringing him home and completing the mission. I chose the mission. I have never forgiven myself for that. Eleanor released his hands and reached into the pocket of her jacket. She withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its creases worn soft by decades of handling. 3 months after we were told Tommy died, I received this. She unfolded the paper and held it out to him. It came through channels I never understood, with no return address and no signature. Just these words. Elias took the paper. The handwriting was familiar. It was his own, from a letter he had written in a hospital bed in Panama, barely conscious, certain he was dying, desperate to ensure that the families of his men knew what their sons had meant. Your son died a hero. The words swam before his eyes. He gave his life so that others could live. I was his team leader. I was with him when he fell. He did not suffer. He did not hesitate. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it without fear. I am sorry I cannot give you more than these words. I am sorry I cannot bring him home. But I wanted you to know that his sacrifice mattered, that it changed the course of history, that he saved lives that will never know his name. Your son was the best of us, and I will carry him with me until my own ending comes. Elias looked up from the letter to find Eleanor watching him. You wrote this. I thought I was dying. His voice was barely a whisper. I wanted you to know. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. The embrace was fierce despite her fragile frame. The hug of a mother who had waited 40 years to hold the last person who had seen her son alive. Thank you. Her words were muffled against his chest. Thank you for carrying him. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for this letter that I have read every single day since it arrived. Behind them, the crowd had dissolved into tears. Hardened generals wept openly. Veterans clutched their own chests where their own tags hung. Catherine had buried her face in Nathan's shoulder, her body shaking with sobs. On the stage, Whitfield wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He had known about Riley, about Webb, about Okonkwo. He had carried his own guilt for 4 decades, the guilt of the survivor, the weight of living when others had died in his place. But he had never seen this. He had never witnessed the moment when sacrifice met gratitude, when the dead were honored by the living, when the terrible mathematics of war resolved into something that looked almost like grace. Elias held Eleanor Riley and felt something shift inside him. A weight he had carried so long he had forgotten it was there began to ease. Not disappear. The dead never truly release their hold on the living, but ease just slightly, just enough to let him breathe. A man approached from the crowd, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with Tommy's eyes looking out of a face that had aged past the point his father would ever reach. He stopped beside his mother, his own face wet with tears. I am Thomas Riley Jr. His voice was thick with emotion. I was born 3 months after my father died. I never knew him except through stories and photographs and this letter that my mother read to me every year on his birthday. He extended his hand to Elias. Thank you for bringing him home, even if it was only in words. Thank you for making sure I knew who my father was. Elias took the hand of the son he had helped make fatherless. The grip was strong, steady, the grip of a man who had grown up in the shadow of a hero and had learned to carry that weight with dignity. He would have been proud of you. Elias's voice broke on the words. Tommy would have been so proud of the man you became. Thomas Jr. pulled him into an embrace, and for a moment they stood together, the team leader and the son, bound by blood that had been spilled 40 years ago in a jungle that did not exist. And somewhere, in whatever place the dead go to watch over those they left behind, Elias could almost hear Tommy's voice. Not your fault, Sarge. It was never your fault. The embrace with Thomas Riley Jr. ended, but the connection it had forged would outlast both of them. Elias stepped back, his eyes sweeping across the pavilion, taking in a sea of faces that had witnessed something none of them had expected when they arrived for a retirement ceremony. Whitfield returned to the podium, his voice carrying the particular resonance of a commander who has found his purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, today was meant to celebrate the end of my career. Instead, it has become something far more important. He paused, his gaze finding Elias in the crowd. It has become a beginning. He gestured to an aide, who approached with a leather folder. General Mercer stepped forward to join him, and together they descended the stage steps to where Elias stood, surrounded by the Riley family. 40 years ago, Whitfield said, his voice pitched to carry, 3 men gave their lives in an operation that could never be acknowledged. The names could not be spoken. Their sacrifice could not be honored. Their families could not be told the truth of how they died or why. He opened the leather folder. That ends today. Mercer stepped forward. By order of the Secretary of Defense, with the personal authorization of the President of the United States, the classification on Operation Phantom Lance has been lifted. He took a breath, and when he continued, his voice trembled with emotion. The names of Sergeant First Class Thomas Riley, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, and Sergeant Victor Okonkwo will be added to the memorial wall at Langley. Their families will receive the recognition they have been denied for 4 decades. Eleanor Riley let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Her son's arm tightened around her shoulders, his own face crumbling with an emotion that had no name. Whitfield withdrew 3 small boxes from the folder. These are long overdue. He turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Riley, on behalf of a grateful nation, please accept the Silver Star and the Intelligence Star, awarded posthumously to your son for gallantry in action and extraordinary heroism in service to the United States of America. Eleanor's hand shook as she received the medals. She pressed them to her chest, her eyes closed, tears streaming freely. 40 years, she whispered. 40 years of not knowing if his death meant anything. 40 years of wondering if he died in vain. Whitfield placed a hand on her shoulder. He did not die in vain. The intelligence your son helped secure prevented a nuclear confrontation that could have killed millions. The world owes him a debt it can never repay. He turned to face the crowd. The families of Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and Sergeant Victor Okonkwo will receive identical recognition. Letters have already been sent. Ceremonies will be arranged. Their names will be spoken, at last, with the honor they deserve. Catherine had moved through the crowd to stand beside her father. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of a connection that had never truly been broken, only buried. Nathan stood beside her, his naval officer's composure restored, but his eyes still red from weeping. Commander Chen approached, her bearing respectful but purposeful. She stopped before Elias and saluted crisply. Master Sergeant Vaughn, I meant what I said earlier. My program exists for men like you. No bureaucracy. No judgment, just a door that stays open. Elias returned the salute with a precision that surprised even himself. The muscle memory of decades of service had not faded, even through years of bridges and shelters and the slow erosion of identity. Commander, I appreciate the offer, but I think my door has already opened. He looked at Catherine, at the gentle swell of her pregnancy, at the future growing inside her. I think it's time I went home. Catherine's grip on his hand tightened. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the gesture achingly familiar. He remembered her doing the same thing as a child, nestling against him when thunderstorms frightened her, trusting him to keep the darkness at bay. Whitfield approached them, the ceremony now transformed into something far more intimate than the retirement celebration it had been meant to be. Elias, he said, his voice low enough that only those immediately nearby could hear. Where are you staying tonight? Elias opened his mouth to answer, but Catherine spoke first. He's coming home with us. The words were not a request or an invitation. They were a statement of fact, as immutable as the laws of physics. He is coming home, and he is staying home, and we're going to spend whatever time we have left making up for the years we lost. Whitfield nodded slowly. Then you'll need these. He withdrew a final item from the folder, a set of papers that he pressed into Elias's hands. Your records, unsealed. Your service formally acknowledged. Your benefits restored. He smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. The country you served is finally prepared to serve you back. Elias looked down at the papers in his hands. Decades of classified operations, reduced to ink and bureaucracy. A lifetime of sacrifice, finally given official form. It should have meant more than it did. But standing here, with his daughter's hand in his and his grandchild stirring in her womb, the papers felt almost irrelevant. What mattered was not on any document. What mattered was standing beside him, finally within reach after years of watching from shadows. General Holt had retreated to the far edge of the pavilion. His face was ashen, his career in ruins, his ambitions scattered like leaves in a storm. He watched the scene before him with the expression of a man who had just learned a lesson that would define the rest of his life. Elias caught his eye across the distance. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Antagonist and protagonist. Accuser and accused. The man who had tried to throw him out and the man who had refused to be diminished. Then Elias nodded. A small gesture. An acknowledgement that carried no malice, no triumph, no satisfaction. Just recognition that they were both, in their own ways, products of a system that had failed to see clearly. Holt lowered his eyes. His shoulders slumped. And then, slowly, he turned and walked away from the ceremony he had tried so hard to control. The crowd began to disperse, but many lingered, reluctant to leave the presence of something they might never witness again. Veterans approached to shake Elias's hand, to offer their own salutes, to whisper words of gratitude for a service they had only just learned existed. Families of fallen soldiers pressed forward with questions about missions, about losses, about loved ones who might have served alongside the legend they had just discovered walking among them. Through it all, Elias remained standing. His body ached with the cancer that was consuming him. His heart ached with the weight of years lost and time running out. But he stayed. He shook every hand. He answered every question. He accepted every salute. Because this was what service meant. Not the missions or the medals or the classified operations that changed the course of history, but the connection, the community, the sacred bond between those who had served and those who loved them. Nathan stepped forward, extending his hand. "Sir," he said, his voice formal but warm, "I have studied your operations for years without knowing I was studying my father-in-law. It will be my honor to drive you home." Elias took his hand. The grip was firm, respectful, the handshake of a man welcoming another man into his family. "Let us go," he said quietly. "I have waited long enough." 3 months became 4. 4 became 5. The cancer that had been given 6 months to kill him seemed to have received different orders, retreating just enough to grant him time he had never expected to have. Elias sat on the porch of Catherine and Nathan's home in Alexandria, a blanket across his legs despite the warmth of the spring afternoon. The hospice nurse had left an hour ago, satisfied that his vitals were stable, that the pain was managed, that the dying man in her care had somehow found a way to keep living. The front door opened, and Catherine emerged, a bundle of pink blankets cradled against her chest. She crossed the porch and settled into the chair beside him, angling the baby so he could see her face. Margaret Riley Vaughn Ellis, 6 weeks old, named for the grandmother she would never meet and the sergeant who had died so that her grandfather could one day hold her. Elias reached out with hands that had steadied rifles and stopped bleeding and carried wounded men through darkness. Those same hands trembled now, weakened by disease and time, but they were gentle as he touched his granddaughter's cheek. "She has your mother's eyes." His voice was rough, but stronger than it had been a month ago. The same eyes, the same light. Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder, the gesture as natural now as it had been foreign 5 months before. "Tell me about her, about Mom. Tell me the things you never told me before." He had spent the past months doing exactly that, filling in the gaps of a lifetime spent in silence, telling Catherine about the missions he had run, the men he had served with, the reasons he had built walls so high that even love could not climb them. She had listened to all of it, the heroism and the horror, the sacrifice and the shame. She had absorbed it without judgment, filing away each piece of her father's history like artifacts in a museum of understanding. "Your mother saved me." He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. When I came back from Granada, I was broken in ways that did not show on the outside. The agency wanted me to disappear, to become someone else, to let Elias Vaughn stay dead. But Margaret would not let me. She found me in that hospital in Panama, talked her way past security and classification and every barrier they put in her way. And she told me that she did not care what I had done or what I had become. She only cared that I came home. Catherine wiped tears from her cheeks with her free hand. The baby stirred against her chest, making soft sounds that had no meaning yet, but would someday form words. So I came home. Elias continued. I buried Spectre. I became a husband and a father and a man who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and grilled hamburgers on the 4th of July. And for 30 years, that was enough. Margaret made it enough. He fell silent, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, children were playing, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. When she died, I did not know how to be that man anymore. The words cost him something, even now. The mission always gave me purpose. The team always gave me identity. Without her, without them, I was just a collection of scars and secrets with no reason to keep going. Catherine shifted the baby in her arms. But you did keep going. I survived. He shook his head slowly. Surviving is not the same as living. I learned that lesson too late. But I learned it. The screen door opened and Nathan emerged, carrying a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade. He sat on the table between them and settled into a chair, his presence a quiet addition to the family tableau. General Whitfield called again. Nathan's voice was casual, but his eyes held a question. He wants to know if you're feeling well enough for the dedication next week. Elias considered the question. The dedication ceremony at Langley, where the names of Riley and Webb and Okonkwo would finally be added to the memorial wall, where the mission that had shaped his life would be acknowledged for the first time in 4 decades, where the men he had carried in his heart would be carried by history. I will be there. His voice held no uncertainty. I promised them I would carry them until the end. This is not the end yet. Catherine smiled, the expression carrying echoes of her mother. Commander Chun is coming too. She said she has 3 new veterans she wants to talk to. Men who are where you were a year ago. In the months since the ceremony, Elias had become an unexpected spokesman for Chen's reintegration program. Not through speeches or formal appearances, but through presence. He sat with veterans who had lost their way, men and women who had fallen through the cracks of a system that did not know how to hold them. He did not offer advice or platitudes. He simply listened. And then he shared his own story, the whole truth of it, the failures alongside the triumphs. It had helped. Not everyone, not always, but enough. Enough to justify the borrowed time he was living on. The baby made a sound, something between a cry and a coo, and Catherine rose to take her inside. She paused at the door, looking back at her father with an expression that held no trace of the anger or grief that had defined their reunion. I'm glad you came to that ceremony, Dad. Her voice was soft. I'm glad you stopped hiding. Elias watched her disappear into the house, his granddaughter cradled against her chest. The door closed behind her, leaving him alone with Nathan and the fading afternoon light. Nathan cleared his throat. Sir, I want you to know something. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression earnest. When Catherine told me about you, about how you left, I was angry. I thought you were a coward who had abandoned his family. Elias nodded slowly. You were not wrong. I was completely wrong. Nathan shook his head. I have studied military history my entire career. I thought I understood sacrifice. I thought I understood what service costs. But I did not understand anything until I watched you stand up in front of that crowd and speak those names. Until I watched you hold Mrs. Riley while she wept. Until I saw what carrying that weight for 40 years had done to you. He met Elias's eyes directly. You're not a coward. You're the bravest man I have ever known. And I'm honored to call you family. Elias felt the words settle into a place that had been empty for longer than he could remember. The place where belonging lived. The place where home had always been, waiting for him to find his way back. Thank you, son. The word came naturally, without thought. It felt right. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent. The shadows stretched longer. The children's laughter faded as they were called inside for dinner. The world turned toward evening, toward rest, toward the gentle darkness that follows every day. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in forms we do not always recognize, please consider subscribing to this channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person whose sacrifice goes unnoticed, whose service remains unacknowledged, whose story deserves to be told? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still in uniform. Sometimes they're sitting on a porch in Alexandria, holding their granddaughter, finally at peace. Elias closed his eyes and let the evening wash over him. The pain was there, always there now, a constant companion that reminded him of how little time remained. But the pain was not all there was. There was Catherine inside, singing softly to the baby. There was Nathan beside him, a son he had never expected to have. There was Whitfield, calling to check on him every week, the debt between them finally balanced. There was the wall at Langley, where 3 names would soon be carved in stone. There was legacy. There was love. There was the quiet grace of an ending that had become, against all odds, a beginning. Still here, brothers. He whispered the words to the evening air, to the ghosts who had walked beside him for 40 years. Still trying. And this time, finally, I am not trying alone. The stars emerged one by one as darkness settled over Alexandria. And Elias Vaughn, call sign Spectre, the ghost who had finally come home, watched them appear with the eyes of a man who had learned, at last, that surviving could become living, that endings could become beginnings, that even the broken could find their way back to whole.